everyone, it's Shaylin, and I'm here today with another writing video. Today I'm going to be talking about writing the beginning of your novel. My last video was on inciting incidents, so I hope that this is kind of a good pairing to that. This is going to talk about novel openings as a whole, and that video was specifically on the inciting incident, so I hope that with these two videos you will be prepared to write a delightful first act of a novel. As I'm filming this, I've been in a novel writing workshop, so I read a lot of novel beginnings in the past 2 months and critiqued a lot of novel beginnings, so I hope I've got some fun things to share and take away from that. So one thing I wanted to share, this isn't necessarily a rule, this is kind of just something I've been thinking about lately, but I think maybe it's kind of a good technique for those of us who are also short fiction writers, is to kind of consider your first chapter as a very open-ended short story. The reason I say this is because I was looking at short stories, my own and those of other people's, and I was thinking, man, how is it that in short stories the writer manages to basically tell us every important thing we need to know about this character, both internally and contextually, in like 4,000 words. Wouldn't it be great if we could match this level of efficiency with a novel opening? And I thought, what if we did? If you're a short fiction writer and you're familiar with that form, take the principles of efficiency that you are familiar with in short fiction and apply them to that novel opening. You don't want to bog down the reader with information, but you also want to give them a picture of your character very quickly. That's like the challenge of a short story, right? Is teaching us who this person is and revealing something important about them in a very short period of time through showing without too much exposition. So if you are a short story writer, I think it's kind of helpful to consider your first chapter as a very open-ended short story, maybe one that's more linear and without flashback than a regular short story might be. Anyways, just thought I would throw that out there since I think thinking of novel openings that way has been helping me lately. So the next thing I wanted to mention was something that I kind of am gonna steal from a friend of mine. I'm so sorry. Is this like intellectual property, copyright infringement? I don't know. Anyways, a friend of mine, shout out to him, mentioned in our workshop in regards to a novel that we were reading that the beginning of a novel is you flirting with the reader. Interesting way to put it, but I think it's a really good way to think about it. A lot of novel openings suffer from kind of just being too boring, too mundane. Now's not the time for that. If you have something fun and cool and exciting, it's time to flirt. If you have some cool ass shit in your book, flirt with the reader rather than just completely withholding. That said, my first point that I wanted to talk about was that this is not the time for the mundane. In the first few chapters of your novel, do not bore us with everyday details. If your average reader probably also does this on a daily basis, in relatively this manner, like brush their teeth, sit on the bus, eat breakfast, eat dinner, wake up and look at themselves in the mirror, maybe do not include those things in your novel opening. You can include these things if your character can bring a really unique texture to these events, or if their situation highlights this in a really different way. Like, it could be interesting to show your character, they live in an abandoned warehouse in a dystopian wasteland, and the story starts with them waking up and brushing their teeth, and that's like the one sense of normality that they have left in their world. That could be interesting. But if your character wakes up and we just see them brushing their teeth and then they go and eat breakfast and then they catch the bus to work, why do I care? I'm gonna read a different book if all that is promised in this book for me so far is everyday life that I myself also experience. A lot of people say that they want to establish the character's status quo, but choose the elements of your character's status quo that are actually interesting and are going to characterize them. If their status quo is relatively the same as everyone's status quo, we can kind of infer that without being told. Number 2, prioritize the present over the past. Backstory is great, but I would say that it's not maybe time for a ton of backstory right now at the very beginning. In your first chapter or two, you might hint at backstory, you might flirt with backstory, so just like a little bit of backstory sprinkled in carefully. But I don't think it's necessarily, in a lot of cases, the best time to just dump backstory on us, because we probably don't really care about backstory until we have stakes in the present. And those stakes will probably appear when you have the inciting incident. You can check out my video on the inciting incident and also my video on flashbacks that I put up. Flashback is usually not a very useful tool until the reader has a desire to know about the past, and at the very start they probably don't have a desire to know about the past because they have no questions making them wonder why the past is interesting. In the beginning, I think it's good to really prioritize visuals. Let us see the world. Let us see the characters, let us see the characters' faces, let us see the characters move, let us see the world they inhabit. I think that can create a really strong vibrance that can really draw your reader in, rather than trying to draw them in through backstory that they probably don't care about yet. Next up, focus on your character's voice. At this point in time, voice is one of your best character development tools. I have a video on voice. You don't really have the breathing room to share backstory yet, but what you always have is voice. Voice will always be here for you, and voice is a great character development tool. We can learn so much about a character through their voice and through how they describe the world and see the world and the phrasing that they use. Even if you don't have the ability to give us a lot of characterizing backstory, you always have the time to give us characterizing voice, since voice is a constantly present element of your story. For me, voice is one of the strongest narrative hooks that there is. If I pick up a book and the character has a really interesting, strong voice, that's a hook for me. Even without knowing anything about the plot, I'm hooked by this character's voice because I'm now intrigued by the character, and that's really what you want, is you want people to be intrigued by your character and say, yeah, I'm gonna dedicate 8 hours of my life to reading about this person. Basically, you're trying to convince your reader that this is a character worth reading about, and voice is one of your best tools for doing that. Next up, make the right promises. So you're flirting with the reader, as we've established. Don't lie to them or mislead them, because that is frustrating. Your opening few scenes and chapter give the reader an idea of what to expect for basically the rest of the plot. It's gonna give them an idea for the tone, emotional texture, mood, atmosphere, type of storytelling, character, kind of just general feeling of the book. They might not have a clear sense of the plot development yet, but they are gonna have a clear sense of the book's feeling. You don't want to be too misleading with the feeling you establish. Unless it's like satire and you're really trying to like upend things really drastically, and that's done purposefully. This is a really drastic example, but let's say you were writing kind of a cute fluffy romance, but the opening scene was the main character brutally slaughtering zombies. That'd be kind of weird. It would be really incongruous, and it would set up the wrong tone and expectation. You would be making promises that you aren't going to keep later on. If there are no more zombies in the book and now it's just a romance, why did we start with zombies? I mean, we could start with zombies. You could have a romance with just like zombies in the background. That'd be kind of funny. But it would be weird to start with like a brutal zombie massacre and set up that this is like an action movie with like some gore, and then there's never any of that again. Keep in mind what promises you're making in terms of the content that's going to appear, but also the emotions and feelings that are going to be prevalent throughout your story. Next up, get your characters moving and doing something interesting. Static characters are really not that interesting to watch, and it's not going to make a very interesting beginning if your character is really static and not doing anything. Even if it's before the inciting incident, if you can get your character doing something, specifically something interesting, that is ideal. Get your character moving so that the world feels alive, but also it gives us an opportunity to learn about the character, to learn about what they do, and also to show us that the character is active. You want to sell that this character is going to be active as soon as possible, because active characters are characters we want to follow. Passive characters are often boring, so if you can show us this character is active and is going to be active early, do it. Get them in a situation where they're acting, where they're doing something interesting. You can show off their skills, show who they are in an interesting way. Whether this is through their career, a skill set they have, or just an interesting element of their personality and their persona that makes them act in an interesting way. Next up, don't overwhelm the reader. In my opinion, it's good to get the ball rolling fast for the main plotline and then start to introduce your subplots and more characters later on once the reader already has momentum because the story is moving. I think if you try to introduce everything right at the start before the ball is rolling, it can be overwhelming, and it's a lot to ask of the reader. You're saying, hey, pay attention to all of this before we really have a story yet. After the inciting incident, you can start to sprinkle in more subplots, more characters, but before the inciting incident, people don't really care yet because there's no story. And finally, as like a final tip, make it weird / specific / original. Give us something that kind of says this is a little strange, but in a way that makes me want to read more. It doesn't have to be straight up super bizarre. Giving us some weirdness that's, you know, like outside the realm of just total normality shows us that this is an interesting, unique world. So either be kind of weird or specific. I love to talk about specificity. I talk about it all the time. Check out my video on making your book more interesting if you want to learn more about specificity. Or just something original. Cliches can really drag down a novel opening. If your novel opens with the character waking up or looking in a mirror or having a dream or eating breakfast, it's kind of tiring. And a big takeaway of this is you don't want to test your reader's patience. This is where your reader is most likely to walk away from the book because they don't have any investment yet. They don't have any investment in the character. If you bog it down with familiar stuff they've seen before, then they're not getting anything new and rich out of your story. So give them something kind of weird to be interested in, or something specific, or something original. Finally, the last thing I wanted to talk about is opening lines. Now, I think first sentence is important. I don't think in a short story, it's really important. I think in a short story, it is very, very important to have a strong first line and a strong first paragraph that has a strong hook, because magazine editors will not give you the time of day if the first paragraph is boring. You know, some novels have not super amazing first lines. Personally, I love a good first line. If the first line is really interesting, it will make up for a little bit of mundaneness to follow. If there's a really good hook in the first sentence, I will keep reading with a lot of intrigue, even if maybe the beginning is a little slower. So kind of to share some examples of great first lines. The first one I wanted to touch on was Everything I Never Told You by Celeste Ng. This is kind of a famous first line by this point because the first line of this book is, Lydia is dead, but they don't know this yet. Now the thing is, the rest of this scene is kind of just the family getting ready in the morning and kind of going about their average daily routine. But there's just this tension because you know that Lydia is dead. This is a great example of how a first line could make a scene that otherwise would have been kind of boring and mundane super interesting. And what she does is she injects tension and shows us her character's status quo without making it seem boring, but it would have been boring without that first. Another book that is a great opening line is The Vegetarian by Han Kang. This book has one of the best openings I've ever read. Before my wife turned vegetarian, I'd always thought of her as completely unremarkable in every way. It's fantastic. Why is this opening line so fantastic? Let's dissect it a little. And the reason it's so fantastic is because it does so many things in so little word. This sentence basically establishes almost every primary element of the conflict. In this one sentence, we have the inciting incident, which is the wife turning vegetarian. We've established two characters, the narrator and his wife, and we've established conflict between them. It's brilliant. Now I thought I would just share a couple more examples of beginnings that I think work well, and what these books do really well is an example of flirting with the reader. First of all, let's take a look at The Girls opening. The Girls opens with this really short little section. You could almost call it a prologue, but it's not really a prologue. It's literally just one page because it shows us something really, really interesting, and then we jump into the main story, and we're not really going to get to this point in time that the beginning is opening with for a while. It just sets up really interesting character dynamics. So the beginning of this book goes, I looked up because of the laughter and kept looking because of the girls. I noticed their hair first, long and uncombed, then their jewelry catching the sun. The three of them were far enough away that I only saw the periphery of their features, but it didn't matter. I knew they were different from everyone else in the park. Families milling in a vague line, waiting for sausages and burgers from their open grill. Women in checked blouses scooting into their boyfriends' sides. Kids tossing eucalyptus buttons at the feral-looking chickens that overran the strip. These long-haired girls seemed to glide above all that was happening around them. Tragic and separate, like royalty in exile. This is an opening that sets up the character's voice and worldview really well, and does a really good job of playing with time. What she did was she started at the most interesting point in time on the timeline, and then jumped back, because it was more interesting to start here. A good example of flirting with the reader. Now, I also just wanted to touch on The Seasons Quartet by Ali Smith, and then she does a similar thing in Winter, that Winter also opens with like a really weird section that I will read. This one's quite a bit shorter, and the interesting thing about this one is you don't realize what it means until a little later on. You realize what is going on. But here's the opening. God was dead to begin with, and romance was dead. Chivalry was dead. Poetry, the novel, painting, they were all dead, and art was dead. Theater and cinema were both dead. Literature was dead. The book was dead. Modernism, postmodernism, realism, and surrealism were all dead. Jazz was dead. Pop music, disco, rap, classical music, dead. Culture was dead. Decency, society, family values were dead. The past was dead. History was dead. The welfare state was dead. Politics was dead. Democracy was dead. Communism, fascism, neoliberalism, capitalism, all dead. And Marxism, dead. Feminism, also dead. Political correctness, dead. Racism was dead. Religion was dead. Thought was dead. Hope was dead. Truth and fiction were both dead. The media was dead. The internet was dead. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Google, dead. Love was dead. Death was dead. A great many things were dead. It's so fantastic, in my opinion, and you realize relatively later on that what this is the main character Googling things and seeing what comes up as dead when you Google it, but you don't know that quite yet, and it's such an engaging, interesting beginning. I immediately want to read on it, even though I don't really know what's going on yet. So those are just a couple strong novel beginnings I wanted to highlight. There are so many different ways to write a strong novel opening. Of course, you could just start with a really strong, interesting scene. Those ones, the three I just read didn't really start in scene. They kind of started a bit pulled out, but with really interesting language or a really interesting snapshot. The girls used that snapshot. Ali Smith used kind of just weirdness. And then Han Kang and Celestine both used really strong first line. That's basically everything I wanted to talk about in this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and if you have any questions, you can always send me an ask on Tumblr. Until next time.